They told us Genma had no face. That was the first lie. Not the kind of lie where someone knows the truth and hides it. The kind where nobody who survived long enough to look came back speaking in full sentences. The briefings we received in the weeks before first contact were assembled from fragments, intercepts from dead relay stations, partial transmissions from 3 colony worlds that went dark in the span of 11 days. A single coherent message from something called the Vega Protocol, which arrived in no alphabet anyone recognized and took 9 days to decode. And when it was finally rendered into language, it said only, "Gather your fire minds and do not let her fight alone." We didn't know who her was yet. I didn't know I was a firemind. I thought I was a topographical scout, with a bad headache that had lasted 4 years. My name is Joe. I was 26 when the Planetary Defense Corps drafted me, 27 when I understood why, and some age I can't quite calculate now. Because the weeks around the battle compressed and stretched in ways that don't convert to a normal calendar. I'll tell it the way it happened. You decide what to do with it. The headache started when I was 19, not migraines, something more specific than that. Pressure behind the eyes, with a directionality to it, like a compass needle pulled towards something I couldn't see. I'd be scouting ridge lines in the northern survey zones, and I'd know before I crested any hill what the terrain looked like on the other side. Not guessing, knowing, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. Without thought, without effort. The information simply already there when you reached for it. She mapped 300 kilometers of complex terrain in the first year of my posting. My supervisor asked me twice how I was completing the advanced surveys so accurately. I told him I had good spatial memory. He seemed satisfied. I was not. There were other things. I'd walk into a debriefing room and know before anyone spoke what the news was. Good or bad? Which kind of bad? Approximately how bad? Not from reading faces. Though I did that too, everyone does. This was prior to faces. Prior to entry into the room. Standing in the corridor with my hand on the door handle, already knowing, I could tell when equipment was about to fail. Not from sound or smell, or any conventional warning, but from a felt wrongness, a kind of sour note in my peripheral awareness that I couldn't attribute to any sensory input. I predicted an engine failure on a survey aircraft 4 days before it happened, and grounded the aircraft and filed the report. And the maintenance crew found the fault, and told me I was lucky to have caught it. I said nothing. I wasn't lucky, I had felt it. I stopped talking about it after a while, filed my reports, did my work, kept the antenna in my skull pointed at the ground, and pretended it wasn't there. Went home to my apartment in the survey district. Cooked meals, maintained correspondence with my family. My sister wrote to me weekly, and I wrote back, and I never told her about any of it, which was a kind of loneliness that didn't have a name. The isolation of carrying a piece of equipment you can't explain to anyone and can't set down. The draft notice came on a Tuesday. 1 page, no explanation beyond specialized perceptual assessment, a departure time and a location and a single instruction. Tell no one. The facility they brought me to was underground, somewhere in the northern latitudes. I was hooded for the transit, which should have told me something, and the vehicle's route made no sense to any map I carried internally, which told me more. The room they sat me in had no windows, and smelled of recycled air and ozone, the particular sharp mineral smell of equipment that runs constantly and is never shut down. The lighting was cold and steady. The table was gray steel. 3 people in the room, 2 in uniform I didn't recognize, cut and insignia that didn't match any branch I knew, which meant either private or intergovernmental. And the calm economy of their movements said military regardless of the patch on the sleeve. One who was not in uniform at all was sitting at the end of the table, and the first thing I noticed, before her face, before the silver white of her hair, before the stillness she carried like a physical object she had learned to set down carefully in rooms, was that my compass needle headache went silent the moment I saw her. 4 years of low-grade directional pressure. Just gone, the way a noise you've lived with vanishes when the source is found. Relief exactly, recognition. As if whatever had been pulling at me had crossed a room and found the thing it had been pointing at. She was perhaps 30, perhaps older, the kind of age that sits quietly on a person and doesn't announce itself. The silver white of her hair was not gray, not dyed. It had that color the way certain stones have color, inherently, as part of what it was. Eyes were a shade I had no word for. Not quite blue, not quite silver. Something that occupied the visible spectrum the way certain stars do. Present, light-emitting, and just slightly unreal, as though the color was continuous with the space around it, rather than boundaried by her iris. She was sitting stills in a way that was not the stillness of someone waiting. It was the stillness of someone who had already arrived. Her name was Lira. I learned that later. At the table, she introduced herself only as the scout coordinator, which was so obviously false that I had to work briefly to suppress the expression that wanted to cross my face. And then I noticed the way the two uniformed men held themselves. Slightly angled toward her, the way you orient toward a heat source without making a decision about it. And I understood that whatever her actual title was, it carried a weight the room couldn't comfortably contain. And she had chosen not to deploy it in this particular moment, which was itself a form of sophistication. She asked me 3 questions. They weren't the questions I expected from a perceptual assessment. First was, when you know something you have no information to know, does it come as sensation or as certainty? I said. Certainty. Like remembering something that hasn't happened yet. She noted this without expression. The second, when you're in a crowd and someone nearby is frightened, does it feel like your own fear? I said yes. I said it before I decided to answer honestly. The honest answer came out before the calculated one, and I left it. She noted that too. The third, have you ever wanted to stop? I looked at her across the gray table. She was watching me with those off-spectrum eyes, and she already knew the answer to all 3 questions. I could feel that. Not as a supernatural perception, but as the simple reading of a person who has already done the research and is now confirming it. She was asking to see if I'd tell the truth. I said, every day, since I was 22, I want it gone. I want to be a person who walks into rooms and doesn't know things. I want to file surveys and come home and not feel the weather that's 100 kilometers away, or know which of my colleagues is hiding a medical diagnosis, or stand in a corridor with my hand on a door handle, and know before I open it what's on the other side. She said very quietly, I understand that. I said, I know you do. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I need someone for whom the answer to the third question is still the honest one. Who has wanted to stop and still hasn't? Who is still here with it, functioning? That is a rarer quality than the gift itself. I didn't fully understand what she meant by that until much later. The briefing they gave us over the following 72 hours used the word entity, because no other word adequately fit. Genma was not a creature in any sense I had a framework for. Not a ship, or a fleet, or a civilization that had made a choice about expansion or conquest. The best the combined analysis teams could offer after months of work was this: an ancient concentration of destructive, psionic energy, self-sustaining, self-directing, possibly conscious in some sense that bore no structural resemblance to biological consciousness. It had been moving through this arm of the galaxy for longer than our species had existed. Not drifting, moving, purpose, or with something that functioned as purpose, the way a river's movement functions as purpose. Not decided, but directional, consistent. Following a logic, the worlds it reached went silent, destroyed in any conventional sense. Not bombed or burned or irradiated or poisoned, silenced. The psychic and electromagnetic signatures of a living world. Extinguished, the way you extinguish a candle. Candle remained, the wax, the wick. All the physical infrastructure of a planet, the rock, the atmosphere, the water, the carbon-based chemistry of what had been biological systems. All there, intact, simply no longer alive in any meaningful sense. No signals, no movement patterns. No signal complexity of the kind that biological minds generate. The flame, specifically, gone. Perclums that sent fragments before going dark described it differently in each transmission. One called it a hunger. One called it a tide. One, the third, the last, the most coherent, called it a silence that moved, and said that the worst thing was not that it was coming, but that some part of you, some deep wordless part that preceded language and reason, wanted to let it arrive. That there was something in the entity's presence that read, on the most primitive levels of cognition, like rest, like the cessation part, like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for a long time. That last detail did not appear in the official briefing. I found it in a raw intercept file I was not supposed to access. I accessed it anyway because my compass needle had turned sharply toward that particular archived folder the moment I walked into the analysis bay on the second day, and I had stopped pretending the needle wasn't pointing at things worth following. I read it twice. I understood what it meant. If the entity generated that sensation, that particular gravity toward dissolution, then the most dangerous thing about it was not its power. The most dangerous thing was that it would make defenders want to stop defending. It would make the fight feel like the wrong direction. It would create, in the deepest pre-linguistic structures of anyone facing it, a pull towards simply becoming quiet. The file back and went to find Lira. She was in the anteroom, off the operations center, which I would learn was her default late evening location. I had not been there before. She was sitting at a small table, with tea cooling, in front of her, and a set of maps I recognized as the outer orbital sensor readings. Current feed, and she was looking at a specific quadrant of the northern hemisphere's orbital zone, with the focused concentration of someone who has been looking at the same thing for a long time, and is waiting for it to tell her something it hasn't yet. I sat down across from her. I said, "I read the raw intercept from the third colony." She said, "Which part concerned you?" I said, "The part about the pull toward letting it arrive." She looked up from the maps. She said, "That concerned you and your response to come find me." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I should have included that in the briefing. I chose not to because I didn't want to seed the idea in the team before it was necessary." "That was probably wrong," I said. "It might be necessary soon. If they encounter it without knowing to expect it, it will work better. If they know it's a known effect, they can brace against it." She said, "Yes, I know. I'm correcting the error." She paused. She said, "Why did you come to me rather than flagging it through the official debrief process?" I said, "Because you already know this, and I wanted to talk to someone who already knows it." She looked at me. Then she did something I had not seen her do in the briefing room, or the intake assessment, or the 2 days of orientation sessions. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands and looked at it, and for a moment she was not the scout coordinator or whatever her real title was. She was a person who was tired, and had been tired for a long time, and had gotten very good at not showing it. She said, "I've known what Genma does to defenders for 12 years. I watch the colony reports come in one at a time. I built this team over the past 3 years. I know things about what's coming that I have not put in any briefing, because the human mind, and I count my own in this, can only hold so much at once without becoming unable to function." "Portion it out," I said. "That seems like a heavy thing to carry alone." She said, "It is." I said, "I'm going to sit here for a while. You don't have to tell me anything or explain anything, but I'm going to sit here." She looked at me for a long moment. She said quietly, "All right." I sat there. She went back to her maps. After a while she began saying things. Not because I asked, but because they were thoughts that needed somewhere to go. And I listened. And sometimes I responded. And we stayed there until the operations cycle flipped to morning, and the overhead lighting shifted from cool to warmer. And by then we had found the shape of something that would be difficult to name. Not friendship, or not only that. Something that depended on the specific configuration of what we each carried. The team they had assembled around Lira numbered 9 at its largest. I was the last recruited. The others had been gathered over the preceding months. I was aware of this the way you're aware of the shape of a room you've entered mid-conversation, able to infer the conversation that preceded you. There was a man called Yogin, Indian, very old, older than he appeared, which was itself quite old, who carried his age like weathered stone and sat still in a way that made whatever room he occupied feel anchored, as though his rootedness in the world had a physical dimension. When he spoke, he used very few words, and each word had been selected. When he didn't speak, his silence had a quality that was different from the silence of a person thinking. It was the silence of a person who had already thought most things through and found the thinking useful but not urgent. There was a woman named Dao, Chinese, young, perhaps 25, perhaps younger, whose gift ran toward emotional resonance rather than spatial or predictive perception. She could read the collective psychological state of a group the way a physician reads a pulse. Accurately, without effort, without being asked. She used this almost never visibly, which made her seem quiet in group settings. But in private conversation, she was precise and sometimes devastating, because she told you what you were actually feeling rather than what you had decided to present. I found this disconcerting, and then found it useful, and then came to rely on it. There was Salman, from the Western Survey District, who had been a combat tracker before his gift expressed itself, and who retained the tracker's laterality, not the depth perception of my gift or the forward casting of Lira's prophetic sense, but a cynic peripheral vision, excellent for detecting presences at the edges, the things that didn't want to be looked at directly. Genma's advance agents, it turned out, operated exactly in that register, and Salman was worth more to the perimeter operation than anyone except Lira herself. There was Morella, who had been a physician before she was anything else, and who remained one, whose gift bent toward healing and neural stabilization. She was the only one among us who could partially counteract the mental erosion Genma's proximity caused. The dissolution pressure, the pull toward the quiet. Shh. She couldn't block it. She could slow it, shore up the integrating function of a mind under that kind of stress. Buy time. In the weeks ahead, she bought a great deal of time for a great many people. And there were 4 others whose names I will not write here, for reasons that will become clear. Lira was not one of us in the sense the word usually implies. She was not a peer or a teammate in the operational sense. She was the axis around which the team's function organized itself. The way a lens is not the light, but is the thing through which the light becomes useful. What she carried, the full expression of her psionic gift, sharpened over decades of conscious development, focused by years of preparation for this specific confrontation, was the only weapon that had ever demonstrated any measurable effect on Genma at all. A wound, not a kill, an effect, a hesitation in the consuming forward motion, like driving a spike into a current of water. The spike didn't stop the current, but it created a still zone behind it, a space where the current's force was interrupted. And in that space, it was theoretically possible to act. Theory had never been tested. Every other world that had tried had not reported results. Vega told us this. Vega was not human. The briefing called him a cybernetic strategist, which was technically accurate, the way calling the ocean a body of water is technically accurate. Describing the category without beginning to convey the thing. He was ancient. 2,000 years old, by his own accounting, built into a mechanical frame after his organic body was destroyed by Genma's advance wave, the last surviving defender of a world this entity had consumed before our civilization had developed written language. He had been tracking Genma's path for centuries. He had assembled teams on other worlds and watched them fight and watched them fail, and he had kept going, because stopping was not a thing he was capable of deciding. The thing about Vega was that he had no illusions. He had watched worlds try and fail. He was not without hope. You don't spend 2,000 years in pursuit of a confrontation you consider futile. But his hope was specific and evidence-based, and he did not mistake it for certainty. He told us this in the first full team briefing, standing at the center of the operations room, with the star maps behind him showing Genma's trail. A long, curving scar across 4,000 light-years of charted space, every system on it dark, the path of a tide that had been moving since before most of the objects in those systems had formed, he said. I will not deceive you about your odds. I will tell you what has worked and what has not. What has worked fractionally, once, on one world, was a single sustained psionic disruption channel, held long enough for a secondary defensive action to close the entry gate. Did not work was everything else that has ever been tried. He paused, very precisely. He said, the human trait I have observed most consistently among your species, across the 14 months I have spent on this world, is that you do not accept the odds you are given. I am choosing to regard this as an asset. No one laughed. Yogin in the corner made a sound that might have been the beginning of one. Old and dry and very controlled. Vega looked at him. Yogin looked back. Something passed between them that I didn't fully read, but that felt like the recognition of 2 things that had been around long enough to find certain truths funny. The advance agents arrived 6 weeks after we assembled. 6 weeks that we spent training, calibrating, running the psionic resonance models, learning each other's gift signatures well enough to work in proximity without interference. 6 weeks during which the northern orbital sensors showed nothing alarming, and the situation reports were manageable. And there were evenings in the anteroom with cold tea and maps and conversations that ranged further than the operational brief. I learned in those weeks that Lira had grown up in a country that no longer existed, a small state that had been absorbed into a larger one before she was 10, and that she carried its geography in her memory the way you carry a language you learned first. Accurately, emotionally, without being asked. I learned that she had expressed her gift publicly once at 17, and nothing where she was attempting to prevent a specific harm, and the harm had been prevented. And she had been removed from her family's custody within 48 hours, and placed in a training program she had not agreed to, and that the people who ran that program had meant well, and had been almost entirely wrong about what she needed, and that she had spent the following decade correcting their errors through the application of superior information. I learned that she had a particular intolerance for being told how to feel about things, which she managed by simply not advertising what she felt until she had decided what to do about it. I told her about my sister's letters, about the loneliness of writing back without being able to say any of the true things. She listened without comment, and at the end she said, "You could write to her after." I said, "After." She said, "After." Neither of us discussed what after meant in terms of probability. The conversation moved on. The advance agents arrived before we were ready. They didn't look like extensions of Genma. That was functionally deliberate. Not in the sense that a mind had planned the deception, but in the sense that the entity's nature made subtlety its default mode of approach. Direct confrontation could be perceived and responded to. Dissolution from the edges, dissolution so gradual it registered as noise rather than signal, was harder to catch. Agents were pieces of Genma's psionic field that had separated from the main body and propagated ahead, attracted by the concentration of psionic activity our team represented. They didn't look like anything. They looked like static in the air, a visual shimmer, the kind of depth perception distortion that your brain processes as a trick of light and files without alarm. Salmon detected the first one. He came to the operations room at 3 in the morning, military quiet, and said without preamble that something was standing in the eastern corridor and had been standing there for approximately 4 hours. His peripheral gift had caught it the way you catch movement in the corner of vision. Not from looking, but from not looking. From the register your attention occupies when it's not focused. We evacuated the eastern corridor. We found nothing visible to sensors. We sealed it anyway and moved operations east-facing functions to the western complex. The second and third we caught by the symptoms they left. One of the 4 I won't name began losing coherence during a routine calibration exercise. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been visible to anyone not watching for it. His sentences ran slightly long. His conclusions arrived fractionally slower. He repeated 2 words in the same briefing that he had already used and showed no awareness of the repetition. Mirella recognized it. She had the medical literature memorized, every reported case of psionic exposure damage, and she recognized the pattern from its earliest stage. Gradual dissolution of the integrating function, the part of the mind that holds everything together as a continuous self, the part that maintains the coherence of I over time, like watching ice become water time, very slow, irreversible past a point. She worked for 36 hours straight. Sleep in 2-hour blocks, back to his side, she could slow it. She was honest about the fact that she could not stop it. By the 40-hour mark she had him stabilized at approximately 60% coherence, which was enough for him to know what was happening to him, which he said was worse than not knowing. He was extracted to a medical facility. The facility's reports, which I received 3 weeks later, were careful and not hopeful. We lost the second to a direct encounter. She was checking the northern perimeter at dawn, alone, which violated the 2-person rule. But she had told no one she was going, and the violation was discovered after the fact. She saw one of the shimmer agents in the corridor, and moved toward it rather than away, which Vega had told us in absolute terms was the wrong response, but which the deep instinct of a person whose gift ran toward perceiving and engaging the invisible made almost impossible to override. Gift said, "There is something there, attend to it." The operational brief said, "Do not." The gift was older and faster. She engaged. The agent didn't touch her. It was simply near her, and proximity was enough. We found her walking in slow circles in the perimeter zone, moving through the same 30-meter circuit repeatedly. Her face perfectly calm, her eyes showing the particular quality of a person no longer wholly present. Morella worked. She got back approximately 40%. The woman was alive when they took her out. She was not coherent in any way that would allow her to continue the mission or, eventually, the tasks of a daily life. Lira said nothing about these losses in any briefing or debrief. She said nothing about them in any setting where others could see her face while she processed. She said things only to me, late in the evenings, in the anteroom, without announcement. She would appear, and I would have tea already made, because I had learned the rhythm of when she would appear. And she would sit, and sometimes she would say nothing, for the first 20 minutes, and that was fine. She said things like, "Vega has watched this attrition happen to every team he has ever assembled. He expects it. I know he expects it. What I cannot determine is whether this means he has found a way to not feel it, or whether he feels it, and has simply developed the capacity to continue functioning anyway. I don't know which of those I am supposed to be working toward," she said. "I have had my gift since I was 8 years old, 22 years of clear sight. Do you understand what it is like to see things clearly for 22 years? To know what is coming with enough certainty to act, and to watch the people you have gathered to act be removed one by one before the action is needed." Once very late she said, "I keep counting. I try not to, but I kept counting. How many are left? Each loss means for the configuration, whether the numbers still work." I said, "Do they?" She said, "Vega says yes. I believe him." "But the numbers working doesn't help with the counting," I said. "No, it doesn't." She was quiet. Then, "Why don't you run?" And this time Charleston had a different weight to it than the first time she'd asked it in the intake room. This wasn't an assessment question. It was a real one, asked in the dark, by someone who had watched people leave and wondered about the math of staying. I said, "I've been sitting with a compass needle in my head for 4 years, not understanding what it was pointing at. You found me and told me what it was for. That's not a thing I can go back from. I can't unknow it and return to filing surveys. And I don't want to leave you here doing the counting alone." She looked at me. She said, "That last part." I said, "That last part." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "I find I cannot follow Vega's advice on this one. He told me, after the first team failed, to stop counting on individuals, to treat the team as a system, stop knowing people's names before they were lost. I could not do it with you," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm not sure whether that's a vulnerability or not." I said, "Vega seems to think it isn't," she said. "Vega has run the resonance models 3 more times this week. Each time they come back pointing at the same configuration. He's very quiet about it," I said. "When a man who's been planning this for 2,000 years gets quiet about something, I pay attention." She said, "Yes, so do I." The entity's vanguard reached the outer orbital perimeter on the 43rd day. The shimmer agents intensified. They were scouts, advanced projections of Genma's attention. And now that attention had turned fully toward this system, toward this concentration of psionic fire mines, toward the one place in this region of space that had the configuration capable of opposing it. We lost the third of the 4 I won't name on day 45. A direct encounter, early morning, no witnesses. The medical team found him in a storage room, seated, eyes open, breathing. Just seated, without purpose or awareness, like stopped clock. The 4th on day 47. He walked out of the facility at 400, and no one registered his departure, because the sensors didn't flag an exit that looked deliberate. He walked slowly, normally, through the east perimeter door, and the sensor logged him as operational movement. We found the gap in the overnight log during the Eero 800 review. Salmon swept the perimeter. Nothing. No signal, no trail, no body, no sign. Vega pulled the full sensor archive and found one anomaly. In the hour before the exit, the northwest corridor sensor had logged a visual distortion lasting 40 seconds. Then the man's exit. The agent hadn't needed to touch him directly. It had simply been close enough, long enough. 6 of us remained: Lira, Vega, Yogan, Tao, Salman, and me. Vega called a briefing. He was very quiet in the way that meant his models had finished running and he had looked at the output and made his decisions. He pulled up the star maps and the orbital sensor feeds and pointed to a region above the northern hemisphere where the measurements had been returning anomalous readings for 72 hours. Not matching any natural phenomenon signature. Not matching any known technological signature. Sitting at the edge of the sensor web's classification ability, labeled in 3 successive reports as unresolved. He said, "This is where it will enter the operational zone. The timing models have a window of 9 hours from now." Paused. He looked at each of us briefly in turn. He stopped at me for longer than the others. "The human scout is central to the operation. Not supporting, not peripheral, central. I have run the resonance models 47 times. The configuration returns consistent results. His gift pattern, in sustained proximity and contact with the princesses, creates a stabilizing resonance that no other combination this team's or any team I have previously assembled has matched. The channel requires both of them. Without the anchor, the channel holds for 40 seconds. With the anchor, the models project a sustained channel of 8 to 14 minutes, depending on field intensity." Salman looked at me. Tao looked at me. Yogan in the corner looked at the floor, which with Yogan was a different thing than looking away. I said, "You have known this since the intake assessment." Vega said, "Yes," I said. "Explain why you didn't tell me in the first briefing," he said. "Because individuals informed of their centrality to an outcome at the outset consistently perform suboptimally. The knowledge produces either paralysis or performance modification that degrades the natural gift expression. I needed you to become yourself under normal condition, before I needed you to be yourself under abnormal ones. The approach was calculated. I will accept any objection to it after the operation." Yogan made the sound, very dry, trolled, more fully a laugh than previous versions. Vega looked at him. Yogan looked back. The same exchange as before. I sat with the anger for a moment, held it, turned it over, set it down. There was no time for it to serve a purpose. I said, "Explain exactly what the anchor function requires," he explained. The channel Lira would open was a sustained psionic disruptive frequency, a very specific tone in the resonance band that Genma's consuming field couldn't simply absorb or override, the way certain frequencies interfere with each other rather than combining. Holding the channel required external stabilization because the gift feedback, the escalating return of the generated frequency through the generator, would overwhelm Lira's own integrating function in approximately 40 seconds, collapsing the channel from the inside. My gift, its reception capacity, its re-radiation structure, the specific way the compass needle had spent 4 years absorbing signal and re-emitting it, could take that feedback, scatter it, let it dissipate through my own system rather than looping back into hers, extending the channel from 40 seconds to 8 to 14 minutes. The difference between a momentary interruption and a sustained still zone. In that still zone, Vega, Yogan, Tao, and Salman would execute the secondary action, locating and collapsing the 4 spatial anchors of the entry gate, folding the aperture in on itself, sealing the point through which Genma's full presence was attempting to pour. The gate collapse was achievable with 4 operators. The channel had to hold while they worked, I said. And if the feedback exceeds what I can scatter, he said, the dissolution pressure would begin to affect your integrating function. Lira has described the phenomenology to me. It presents initially as a sense of the boundaries becoming uncertain. Then, depending on duration and intensity, as a pull toward the quiet. The same pull the colony described. Experienced from inside rather than observed from outside, I said. Understood. He looked at me for another moment. He said, I have assembled 11 teams across the centuries. On 2 of them, the anchor held long enough, on both occasions. The anchor was held by a person whose dominant internal state was not courage in the theatrical sense, but the particular form of stubbornness that operates independently of emotional state. People who held were not fearless. They were not unaffected. They simply did not stop. Observed this quality in you. It was the primary factor in my selection, I said. That's an uncomfortable thing to be chosen for, he said. Most important things are. She and I walked the perimeter together in the hours before the window. The others were running final calibrations and Vega was running his final models, and Lira and I walked the outer fence of the facility in the cold northern air, with the autumn coming in on the wind. The sky enormous and clear in the way that northern skies have. Too large to be comfortable. A sky that doesn't pretend the scale is human. The sensor distortion had been building for 6 hours, not visible to eyes but present to my gift. A pressure accumulating in the orbital north, a weight on the upper atmosphere the way storm weight sits on a lowland before the front arrives. Except no storm front has a quality of intent. This did. Not human intent, not any kind of intent I had a word for. Directional. Purposeful in the way a river is purposeful. Not thinking but going somewhere. She was quiet for the first circuit of the perimeter. I matched her pace and didn't push it. She said, "I need to tell you something I have not told anyone else." I said, "All right," she said. "I have seen this fight in fragments for 3 years. My gift, the forward casting, the prophetic window, it doesn't give me clarity the way a prediction gives clarity. It gives me images, impressions, emotional textures, frames without context. I have seen the channel open and hold. I have seen the gate close. These are real images, not hopes, not fears. The actual images my gift generates when it casts forward. They are positive." She paused. She said, "But in none of the images have I seen clearly what happens to you afterward. And I have looked, specifically, repeatedly," I said. "That could mean a lot of things," she said. "Yes, I know. I have considered all of them. I am telling you not as a warning or a prediction. I am telling you because you deserve to know what I know." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "If the feedback breaks through the margin, if the dissolution pressure crosses the functional threshold, it won't be painful in the conventional sense. The accounts describe as becoming very quiet, as feeling like rest. Shh. I want you to have that information before it becomes relevant, rather than during." I said, "Does it happen quickly or slowly?" She said, "I don't know. No one who has experienced it, past the critical point, was able to report back with the necessary detail." I said, "Helpful." She made a sound that caught me off guard. Not quite a laugh, almost. Something that surprised itself. A response to an unexpected stimulus. A sound I had not heard from her before. And it had warmth in it, real warmth. The warmth of someone who had been very serious for a very long time, and found a specific human being capable of surprising her with a one-word observation at the wrong moment. She said, I'm sorry it has to be you specifically." I said, "You have been building toward this fight since you were 20 years old. You've watched worlds go dark from a distance and spent years assembling the tools to prevent it happening here. And you've watched half those tools be taken away in the weeks before the moment. I'm a scout who can absorb signal and hold a frequency steady. Don't apologize to me." She stopped walking. Shh. I stopped beside her. We were at the northern edge of the perimeter fence, facing the direction the pressure was coming from, and above the horizon the distortion had taken on a quality that was almost visual. Not quite, but almost. A darkening that wasn't weather, a texture in the upper air. My gift was reading it clearly now. Not the compass needle of mundane orientation, but something larger, a reception of something much larger, trying to pour itself through a small opening, the way you can hear the pressure of a great volume of water behind a dam before you can see the dam failing. She said, "I am afraid that I will survive it and you will not. I have been afraid of that specifically since I understood what the resonance requires." I said, "That's a heavy thing." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'll tell you what I told you before." She looked at me and said, "I'm already here." She held my gaze for a moment. Something in the off-spectrum color of her eyes had shifted. Not the color itself, but the quality behind it. The thing the color was expressing, the same way a room looks different when you understand what it contains. A long discipline was down, or she had held back, by practice or by necessity or by the earned caution of a person who had watched people not come back. That thing was present in her face now. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to. She said, "Stay within 3 meters. No matter what happens to the frequency, no matter what you feel or don't feel, physical proximity, not psionic contact. The resonance requires actual nearness. 3 meters or less. I said, understood. She said, if the others fail and I have to hold past this margin. I said, I'll hold the anchor. She said, you may not be capable of. I said, I'll hold it. She looked at me, then she nodded once. The nod of a person who has decided to trust something they cannot verify, because they have looked at everything that is verifiable and found it consistent, and because there is a point at which continued verification becomes its own form of avoidance. We went back inside. The entity arrived at the window exactly when Vega had calculated. There is no language adequate for what the sensors showed. The raw numbers were very large. The visual representation on the operation screens showed a darkening at the northern orbital point. A spreading absence, the background radiation of space simply ceasing in an expanding zone, the way a shadow is the presence of something casting it. But the sensor readings were not what I experienced. What I experienced, the moment Genma's leading edge began to pour through the gate, was the compass needle going silent in a way that was categorically different from the silence in Lira's presence. That silence had been the silence of finding. Arrival at the thing that had been sought. This silence was the silence of erasure. An expanding field of not having been pointed at anything, pressing outward from the entry zone, rolling through the psionic register the way a dead zone rolls through a radio band. Not interference. Absence. The absence of signal where signal should be, which is a worse thing than noise. I understood in my body, not in my thinking, what the last colony had meant. The pull toward the quiet was real. It was not a metaphor. Standing in the operations room with the sensors screaming numbers, my brain was translating into nothing adequate. I felt the leading edge of Genma's field touch the outer surface of my gift, and the sensation was genuinely, like being offered rest, like a hand extended, like a door standing open into a warm room at the end of a very long cold day. Come in, stop carrying it, set it down. I recognized it for what it was because I had been briefed on it. And because I had spent 4 years carrying the compass needle against my will and knowing in my bones what it felt like to want it gone, I knew the quality of that particular want. I knew the shape of the desire to stop, and I knew that this was not the same. This was not my desire. This was something wearing the shape of my desire, wearing it precisely the way a key fits a lock, not by accident, by design or by something that functioned as design. I said, internally, to whatever part of myself that observation was addressed to, no. I crossed the room to Lira. She opened the channel. The tone came through the resonance between us. Not heard, felt. The way you feel a sub-bass frequency in your sternum rather than in your ears. Clean and very precise. A single maintained note in a register that sat just inside the threshold of conscious perception. I felt it make contact with Genma's field the way a blade pressed flat against a current makes contact. Not piercing, not cutting, but introducing a competing structure into the field, a counter pattern that the consuming logic couldn't simply absorb. I felt the feedback begin to build immediately, the escalating return of the channel's own frequency looping back through Lira. And I did what 4 years of unknowing training had apparently prepared me to do. I received it. My gift opened in a direction I hadn't known it could open, a wider aperture than it had ever used for the mundane work of knowing terrain and reading grief through walls. And the feedback came into me and scattered, dispersed through the structure of what I was. And what remained was absorbed without looping back. Channel held. Genma communicated. Not in language, in presence. The full weight of its attention localized on the channel, on us, on the small point of interference in its field. And the communication was not words or images, but a quality, immensity. Not threatening, simply factual. I am very old and very large, and you are very small and very temporary. And this resistance is a function of not understanding that the direction things go is the direction things go. Lira's response was the channel itself. No words, no argument. Simply the frequency, held, steady, the disruptive tone maintained at full amplitude. Felt her through the resonance with a clarity I hadn't expected. Not her thoughts, not her feelings in any specific articulate sense, but her quality. The 22 years of clear sight and steady nerve, the grief of the counted losses, the discipline of a person who had chosen to remain functional rather than remain safe. All of it concentrated into a single sustained act of refusal. Anger. Not defiance in the theatrical sense, simply the opposite of stopping. I held the anchor. The feedback climbed. Not gradually, it climbed in steps. As Genma's full field pressed against the channel, and the channel pressed back, I was aware, in the peripheral register, of Vega and the others working. Salmon's lateral sweep identifying the spatial anchors of the gate. Yogin's deep presence, ancient and rooted, driving anchor lines into the planet's own electromagnetic field, using the Earth itself as a lever. Tao reading the emotional signature of the gate. The entity's field had what she would later call a texture, a complex pattern that was not emotion in any biological sense, but that her gift could parse, and she was finding the structural weaknesses in it, the way a physician finds the lines of fracture in bone, and she was communicating these to Yogin in real time, guiding where to press. The feedback climbed further. I want to be accurate about what happened at the margin. It was not pain. Lira had been right about that. It was a pressure on the integrating function, the felt coherence of being a particular self rather than undifferentiated experience. The boundary between what was me and what was not me became less certain, not in a way that felt threatening exactly, but in a way that felt like the beginning of a long answer to a question I had not asked. The entity's field generated its pull, and the pull was genuine, and I felt it. The warm room, the open door, the extended hand, come in, stop carrying it. I held what I was. Bore. Down on the particularity of my own center, not the center of a concept or a principle, but the specific fact of being this particular person who had said a specific thing to a specific person and had not finished meaning it. Not an abstraction. A fact. This person. This choice not finished. The margin passed. I kept going. I am unable to say with accuracy how long it lasted. The sensors logged 11 minutes and 43 seconds. My experience of it did not have a duration, in any normal sense. The temporal integrating function was one of the first things the pressure affected, and so the 11 minutes were simultaneously very long and no time at all, which is what I would expect from a process that was dissolving the structure, through which time is normally organized. I held what I could. The outer edges went. I felt the boundary between myself and the frequency become uncertain, which was frightening in a way that was very quiet and very large. The precise quality of fear that has nothing theatrical about it. The kind of fear that you sit with because there's nowhere else to go. I thought with a clarity that surprised me by being available. I'm still here. I thought, don't let go. I did not let go. Vega sealed the gate at 11 minutes and 43 seconds. The records show it as a single coordinated event. 4 spatial anchors collapsed simultaneously, the entry vector folding in on itself, the aperture sealing with the particular violence of a wound closing under pressure, a kill. Nothing that ancient, nothing that diffuse, is killed by the closure of one gate, a severance. Genma's presence on this side of the seal was cut off from the main body. The still zone became a closed zone, and the consuming field collapsed without the source pressure sustaining it. The channel cut off. The tone went silent. I became aware that I was on the ground. This surprised me. I had been standing for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. I was apparently no longer standing. The cold northern ground was against my cheek, and the smell of it was specific and real. Wet grass, mineral earth, the particular cold, clean smell of autumn ground in the northern latitudes. And I lay there and registered these things one at a time. This is wet grass. That is the smell of mineral earth. These are specific things, different from each other, both real, both here. I was still here. My gift was running, quieter than before, recalibrated to a lower amplitude by what it had been used for, but running, the compass needle present and oriented, as it had pointed for 4 years without my understanding it, directly at Lira. She was beside me, sitting on the ground with her knees pulled to her chest, her head bowed, her shoulders moving with breathing. Alive. Coherent. I could feel the quality of her presence in the psionic register, not the focused edge of the channel, but something warmer and less directed. The signature of a person present and whole, and exhausted past the point where exhaustion has a description. She was here. She was together. The integrating function was intact. The boundaries were hers. The self was continuous. After a while, she lifted her head and looked at me. She didn't speak immediately. I waited. The northern sky above us was very clear. Stars visible now that the sensor distortion had cleared with the gates closing, the sky doing what it does. Too large, too honest, making no concessions about the scale of things. It was not an unsettling quality at the moment. It was the right quality, she said. You went past the margin. I said I noticed, she said. You came back, I said yes, she said. I couldn't tell. During the channel, I couldn't feel the precise state of your anchor, only that it was holding. I didn't know how far you'd gone until I felt the feedback collapse. She paused. She said, I looked for you in my forward casting, specifically, repeatedly. I could not see you after the channel clearly. And I was afraid I knew what that meant, I said. It turns out what it meant was that I was on the ground, not making it easy to see things clearly. She looked at me. The almost law came again. Fuller now, less contained, something that had been let out of a long discipline. She put her hand on the ground between us and looked at it, and, after a moment, she said, Vega has finished his post-action models. He's coming out. I looked toward the facility. Vega was crossing the perimeter at his 2,000-year-old measured pace. Yogan and Tao and Salman, behind him. All of them alive. All of them present. Carrying the particular weight of people who have held a line and know they will be asked to hold another. I said, what will the models say, she said, that the resonance was sufficient, that we operated on a narrower margin than projected, and that the anchor configuration should be structurally reinforced for future engagements. He'll recommend adjustments to the team for the next gate vector. He won't mention the margin without prompting, I said. And you, she said. I'll ask him about the margin directly. He'll give me the number. I'll note it and move forward. I said, that's what you do with things. She said, yes. Note and move forward. I said, all right. She looked at me. The off-spectrum color of her eyes was doing what it did, and the quality behind it was the same quality I had seen at the northern perimeter fence before the window opened. The long discipline down, the held-back thing present. Not a new thing. The same thing it had been then, confirmed by 11 minutes and 43 seconds, and whatever had happened in the regions past the margin, she said. I told you I couldn't follow Vega's advice, that I was unable to stop counting on you specifically. I said I wasn't sure if that was a vulnerability. I said, what's the assessment now? She was quiet for a moment. Then, not a vulnerability, I said. I'll accept that. Vega reached us and stood for a moment, looking down at the two of us sitting on the cold northern ground. He said, in the precise voice of a man who has just run his 48th resonance model, the operation was successful. The gate is closed. Genma's advance field on this side of the seal has collapsed to non-functional levels. The next probable approach vector is located in the southern hemisphere's orbital band. I estimate a preparation window of 4 to 6 months. Yogan came to stand beside Vega and looked at us, and then looked at the sky for a moment. He said, very slowly, we should eat something before we plan the next fight. Nobody argued with this. Nobody was going to argue with this. I don't know how to end a story that didn't end. Genma retreated from that gate and found another vector. And we found another configuration, and another after that. Vega kept running his models. Yogan kept insisting on eating before any significant decision. Tao kept reading the room precisely and saying devastating accurate things in private. Salman stayed sharp and lateral and caught the things coming from the directions no one else was watching. I stayed close, 3 meters or less. Operational requirement, which was also the true thing, and there are situations in life where the operational requirement and the true thing are the same thing. And when you find one of those situations, you stay in it. I had a gift for staying. I came by it the hard way, which is the only way it counts. The compass needle never went silent again. 4 years of wanting it gone. And then one night in an anteroom over cold tea and maps, I stopped wanting it to stop. It was pointing at something that mattered. That turned out to be enough.